All right. I'm going to get started because, like always, we have a very packed hour of learning for you. So welcome back to Dissemination Essentials. This is Module 2, and we're happy that you are still with us, still here on the journey. The topic for this module in June is ensuring a reasonable representation of the evidence. So it's a bit different than what we've done last month. And your trainers are Liz and Nuala, who you will meet very shortly. So, just some quick housekeeping rules for Zoom. You're all experts at this by now, but please mute yourself when you're not speaking. And if you'd like to comment on what's going on in the presentation or chat with one another or us, please use the chat function on your screen. And just like last time, this is being recorded, and we will post a version of this to the Learning Experience platform so you can watch it afterwards. So we do have a packed schedule of learning. So the amount of in-person questions that we can take is quite limited. But if you do have a burning question or concern, we invite you to let us know by raising your hand, and we'll try to get to you if possible. So we're going to try a quick icebreaker. And what's going to happen now is that there should be a link in the chat box that Dario is sharing. And we invite you to click on that link, which will take you, hopefully, to this page. And this may not work if you're not logged into a Google account. And if that's the case, please just participate in this activity by using the chat box in Zoom. So by now, hopefully, you're seeing this screen on your screens. And we invite you to click the top corner up here. There's a little pointer symbol that says Add Marker. Click on that and put it somewhere in the world where you are today, where you're joining us from. And you can write your name. So I'm joining from Germany, and there I am right there. So I'm going to refresh the screen in a bit to see if we can see where everyone else is joining us from. All right. Who's joining us from Nigeria? Oh, there's no name there, but welcome. A lot of people in the EU and the UK. I guess that makes sense considering the time zone of this presentation. Do we have anyone coming in from any other parts today? Let's see. And I'm going to see what's in the chat here. Oh, Olabisi's from Nigeria. I think you're the winner for joining us outside the EU and the UK today. We'll see what happens when we do this on the next webinar. I was expecting a very diverse map, but it's great that we have some good representation from all of the countries over here. That's awesome. I think it would be interesting to do another version of this where you click where you'd like to be joining from right now, which may be different than where we are all located. Okay, let's see if there's any more chats for people who have been able to. Oh, Newcastle, Australia, Singapore. Okay, now we have it. Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you all here. And I'm going to do a very quick recap of what happened in Module 1. So initially, I thought I might be able to summarize some of the things that we were talking about on the Learning Experience platform, but there's such a diversity of topics and questions that are going on that it's impossible to do. One thing that I did notice is that a lot of you are curious about things that will be covered in full in future modules in this course. So I hope you won't mind if for some of those questions, we wait to give you a more detailed response until we get to that module, because the trainers in those modules will have a full scope of answers for you for some of your questions on plain language or designing dissemination products. So stay tuned for those later in the course. The other thing that we're so pleased with is that a ton of you are responding to each other's questions and comments on the Learning Experience platform, which is great because so many of you have expertise in all of the areas that we're covering. So for us, a perfect situation is where you are responding to each other and sharing your knowledge and your experiences with one another. So continue to do that. And if you haven't already, go on to the Learning Experiences platform and find some comments that you feel like you can answer, or some questions that you feel like you can answer. And hopefully we create a pretty strong community on there. Lastly, before I hand it off to Liz and Nuala, I sent out a very brief survey in the last email that I sent around at the end of last week. And that survey was to ask you about Module 1. So thank you to everyone who's been providing feedback. So far, it seems like overwhelmingly positive feedback, which is great to hear because we don't really know how it's landing, what we're putting out there. So it's great to hear and great to see that you're enjoying it. And please continue to give us feedback so we can make this course as exciting and useful to you as possible. So enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Liz, who's going to take you through this module.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So hopefully you can all see that. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, so yeah, today we're talking about ensuring a reasonable representation of the evidence. Sorry, bear with me 1 sec, just sorting out my slides. There we go. Okay. So these are the checklist questions that relate to this. So have you specified the population's interventions, comparisons, and outcomes? Have you avoided misleading presentations and interpretations of the effects? And if you've used numbers to present the findings, have you used absolute numbers and labelled them clearly? So before we get going, I just thought I'd quickly introduce us, although you've probably already seen our Flipgrid videos. So Nuala and I are both associate editors in the editorial and methods department of the central executive team, and we work with these three review groups in these three particular review group networks. A large proportion of what we do is quality assurance of reviews before they're published in the Cochrane Library. So our experience is largely with ensuring a reasonable interpretation of the evidence in the review itself, especially in the summary versions and in particular the abstract, which is obviously quite highly accessed. But the principles that we're going to be talking about today can apply to any dissemination product that you might be creating. So the outline of today's session, Nuala is going to start with some common issues that crop up when people are presenting results, which will be followed by a short poll that you can join in with. Then I'm going to talk about how we can avoid some of these common issues by using grade narrative statements. And I'll also talk through a couple of examples that I've seen recently where these statements have been deployed and how they've informed some of the key messages for dissemination. When you're working on dissemination products, the principles of the grade narrative statement approach will help ensure a reasonable representation of the evidence. But it's important to remember that these statements aren't really an exact science, and they involve a lot of judgment sometimes. So discussion with others can be, offer some really valuable insights. So with that in mind, we're going to be breaking out into some small group activity where you can see what it's like to work on creating a narrative statement together. And then at the end of that breakout activity, we'll come back together briefly to close the session, and you can, I'll run through the homework and the things that we might want to talk about in the Q&A session later in the month. So I'm going to hand over to Nuala, who's going to talk about common issues with presenting results. So Nuala, I will try and mute myself.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everybody. So yes, I'm just going to run through some of the most common issues that we would see when people try to present the results, and especially issues that can be seen as confusing or potentially misleading. So the first one, So the first one is when people forget to mention the grade assessment when they present the results. So it's one thing to know what the result is, but we also need to know how certain we are about that result. A typical scenario we might see is what you see in front of you here, where the authors say the review found that the intervention leads to a large improvement, for example, in pain. But we don't know how certain are we about this result. Without that information, this looks like a really impressive result. If we move on to the next slide, I think. Yes. Now, eventually, we might find out the certainty of the evidence was low. But a problem with presenting it like this is that there's so much text that has gone between those two statements, you almost forget to combine those two pieces of information. We need to know, okay, yes, it leads to a large improvement, but we are uncertain about that evidence. So you should always include information about the certainty of the evidence, but you must try and include it together with evidence about the effect. The two must go hand in hand. It can be done in different ways, and people are still debating the best way to do this. But the important thing is to make sure that you do it, and also that you do it consistently in a way that makes sense and is appropriate and reasonable. Another problem we see quite frequently is when people tend to focus on the statistical significance of a result. This is a very common sentence that we would see: the treatment led to a statistically significant improvement in pain. But all this, when you say something is statistically significant, all you're actually saying is that this result is unlikely to be by chance. It doesn't actually tell you anything about whether this improvement in pain was clinically significant, or whether how significant this improvement was to the patient. So we're really trying to get people to stop focusing on statistical significance and instead focus on clinical significance, i.e. how significant or important is this difference to the patient. A third problem that we see very frequently is people not explaining the scales that are used for a result. So again, here's a very common sentence we'll see: there was a 2-point reduction in pain measured on the Hatifnit scale. But this, we don't know how to interpret this without more information about this scale. I have no idea what this scale is. I've never heard of it. I don't know, is it a scale that goes from 1 point to 10 points, in which case, yes, a 2-point reduction is quite a big thing. Or is it going from 1 to 100 points, in which point a 2-point reduction really doesn't seem to be that big of a difference. Also, we don't know whether, a high score or a low score is a good thing or not. There's a lot we don't know, and therefore a sentence like this doesn't actually tell us anything informative. And another problem, which again is very common and is some people, including myself, do struggle to get our head around it sometimes, is confusing evidence of no effect and no evidence of an effect. Now, this is a tricky one to get. So a very common sentence we'll see is, there is no evidence to support the intervention. But what does that actually mean? Are the people who wrote this saying, okay, we know that it definitely doesn't work? Or are they saying, we actually don't know whether or not it works? Ideally, the word no evidence, that should only be used whenever there's literally no data available. So if there's no data, then yes, there is no evidence. But if there is data and the data is just very uncertain, then it's not that there is no evidence to support the intervention. It's just that there is only uncertain evidence regarding this intervention. Or it could be that there's only little to no evidence regarding this intervention. But it's a tricky concept, and it does take a while to get used to it. So I might just pause for just 1 second just to let that try and resonate a bit. Okay. And then the final one that we do come across a lot is people trying to formulate their findings as recommendations. So again, this is very tempting especially when you get to the end of a Cochrane review and you have all this information, and it's a human instinct to say, so therefore, here's what I think should happen next. But the aim of a Cochrane review is not to provide recommendations. It is just to provide a summary of the best available evidence. It's not to recommend what people should actually do with that evidence. Apart from anything else, it's the recommendation that you as an individual might want to make based on the evidence in front of you. It could be completely different depending on, the country you live in, the resources that are available, patient preference, clinician preference. There's too many varying factors for anyone to be able to make a worldwide recommendation. So as a Cochrane review, all that can be done is provide a general interpretation of the evidence, and don't try to go beyond that with recommendations. Okay, so now we have a 5-minute task for you. We're going to show you 4 examples of statements, and we want you to think about each, whether we should or shouldn't use them to talk about the results from a review. We'll show you the statements one at a time, so you have time to think about each statement, and then you can vote yes, no, or not sure based on this information that you've now heard. Okay, so we have the first one up there. There's sufficient evidence to recommend the use of treatment Z for syndrome Y. So you can just mark yes, no, or not sure. Okay, great. So we have 9% of you think yes, that this is an appropriate statement. 81% say that no, it's not an appropriate statement, and 9% think that they're not sure. So I think I would have to agree with the 81% who said no. I think the main problem with a statement like this is the word recommend. There is sufficient evidence to recommend the use of treatment Z for syndrome Y. As we were just talking about, we really try to avoid talking about recommendations. Okay, so if we go on to the next poll. Okay, so here we have, there's high quality evidence that treatment Z reduces the symptoms of pain in syndrome Y. Should we use this statement? Okay, so this time we have 68% say that yes, it is an appropriate statement. 23% think that it's not, and 10% are not sure. So again, I think I would think, yes, this is an appropriate statement. I think the main thing that's good about this is that we have the certainty of the evidence presented alongside what the actual effect is. So they're saying that treatment Z reduces the symptoms, but they're also explaining that it's high quality evidence so that we know we can be quite certain about this result. Okay, next poll then. The evidence in our review challenges the current practice of treating syndrome Y with treatment Z. Should we use this statement? Okay, yeah, so yes, 26% of people think this is an appropriate statement, 47% think that it's not, and 26% are not sure. And in this case, I actually agree with the 26% who said that they're not sure. This is part of the problem with presenting narrative summaries of statements, that it is a judgment call, and that there might be sometimes no right or way wrong of doing something. It does just come down to judgment. The reason I'm uncertain about this statement is that it could be seen as giving a bit of a recommendation. The evidence in our review challenges current practice. By saying that you challenge current practice, you're almost saying stop with the current practice. Current practice needs to change. And I'm not sure evidence in our review can ever be strong enough to say that current practice worldwide needs to change. Like I said earlier, you cannot, every country, every district, every clinical practice is different, and it's very difficult to give a sweeping generalization about whether something is challenged throughout the world. So yes, so that one is a very tricky one. That one would come down to, that's the sort of thing you would need to talk about a lot with your authors, but also maybe with decision makers, your key stakeholders. You need to understand exactly who is your audience and what is it they need to know. Okay, and then the last one. Use of treatment Z for syndrome Y is given only limited support based on evidence from our review. Should we use this statement? Okay, so we have 35% think yes, it's okay, 47% think no, it's not, and 18% are not sure. And this is another tricky one that I would maybe say I'm not sure about. I think the problem with this statement is the words given only limited support. The problem is I don't understand what the authors are saying mean by limited support. Do they mean that there is limited data available, or do they mean that there is limited certainty? You know, it's not very clear why it's not only given limited support. So again, I feel like it could be rephrased to be clearer, but again, it's a judgment call. Some people would look at that and think, actually, yes, that's fine. And they would be right to think that it does come down to, you know, the context of the clinical question, your audience, and all the information you have available to you. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Liz now, and she's going to take you through the next section.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nuala. So we're going to look at how we can use grade narrative statements to address some of the issues that Nuala picked up on there. Oh, hang on. Right, slide issues. When we're presenting the results of Cochrane reviews to different audiences, we're trying to find a balance between giving a reasonably precise representation of the evidence on one hand and presenting information that's easy to understand on the other. And that can be quite challenging. How can we tell people what the results of a review are in a way that they understand, but that it doesn't simplify too much? So it goes back to this point that Nuala mentioned earlier about reporting effect and certainty together. You should always report the size of the effect alongside the certainty. And where do we find this information in Cochrane reviews? In summary articles. And this should always be your starting point for the basis of the messages about the evidence that you want to disseminate. So GRADE have been working on a system for creating narrative statements on the basis of summary findings tables for many years, and their latest guidance is in this JCE paper that was published in 2020, led by Nancy Santesso. And a link to this paper is on the LXP as part of the additional resources if you want to read more about the research that underpins the development of this particular approach. And it's a standard approach for creating narrative statements that are based on the size of the effect and the certainty of the evidence. So that GRADE guidance is incorporated into chapter 15 of the Cochrane Handbook, and a section of this chapter about drawing conclusions was suggested as some pre-reading for this particular module. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, I'd recommend that you do so. But in particular, the most important bit is this sort of matrix table, which is table 15.6.b. Which nicely distills the GRADE guidance on narrative statements. So many people will be familiar with summary findings tables, but for those who are less familiar with them, I'm just going to briefly run through the structure of a summary findings table. So the table presents the most important outcomes from the review. So in this case, this is diarrhea and adverse events, etc. Because it reports the most important outcomes, this should sort of help address that one of the problems that Nuala picked up on earlier about which outcomes to include in your dissemination product. Not every outcome in the table will be relevant for your audience, but it should give you a good idea of what the important outcomes are. The results are also given in absolute terms for the control group and the intervention group. The relative effect is given. We'll also talk about the number of participants and the number of studies for that particular outcome. And then finally, the quality of the evidence. So in more recent reviews, you might see that this is called the certainty of the evidence rather than quality, but they mean the same thing. So when you're creating your narrative statements, the bits you need to focus on are the outcomes, the absolute effects, and the certainty of the evidence. So this is typically the kind of information that you want to take from the summary findings table to form your narrative statement. And how do you go about doing that? Well, you use the GRADE matrix, and you take the result for an outcome, and you want to decide whether you think it's a large effect, a moderate effect, a small important effect, a trivial small and important effect, or no effect at all. And then the next step is to look at the certainty of the evidence for that particular result. So is it high, is it moderate, is it low, or is it very low? And then we can use the matrix for our statement. So if there is high certainty evidence, you don't really need to modify your statement in any way. You can simply say, excuse me, that the intervention leads to a large reduction. It reduces, It reduces slightly or makes no difference to the outcome. Hang on 1 second. If there's moderate or low certainty evidence, you probably need to modify your statement because we're less confident about that particular evidence. So the guidance suggests using probably where there's moderate certainty evidence and may where there's low certainty evidence. If there's very low certainty evidence, it's a bit more straightforward. Very low certainty evidence means we don't have much confidence in the result at all. And so you might not want to focus on the size of the effect. You might just want to say that the evidence is very uncertain. However, if you think your audience do need to know about the size of the effect, you could use the terms for low certainty evidence. So for example, if you thought it was a small important effect, you could say it may reduce the outcome, but the evidence is still very uncertain. So these are the general principles that you may need to sort of amend the wording to fit the review that you're working with, and particularly if you're writing in a language other than English. But remember that any amendments or translations that you make should follow the underlying principles of using a consistent approach to describing the size of the effect and the certainty of the evidence. And you need to give your reader some warning when the evidence is anything less than high. So let's just run through this particular example. So this is a review on the effects of probiotics for children who are taking antibiotics. So when children are taking antibiotics, they may develop stomach problems like diarrhea. And one possible solution is to give them probiotics while they're taking the antibiotics. So what did this review find? So I've removed some of the erroneous or unnecessary columns from that summary findings table, so we can just focus on the things that we're interested in, so the outcomes, the absolute effects, and the certainty of the evidence. And looking at the first outcome instance of diarrhea, in the control group, so children who didn't take prebiotics, 191 out of 1,000 children got diarrhea when they were taking antibiotics. But in the children who were given probiotics, only 88 per 1,000 actually got diarrhea. So that seems like a good result. And if you look at the confidence interval, the best case scenario is that 67 children got diarrhea, and the worst case scenario is 116 children got diarrhea. So even that worst case scenario is a pretty good result. And then you need to look at whether you think that's a large effect, a moderate effect, a small but important effect, or little or no effect. And for this particular example, I think that that's probably a moderately sized effect. Actually, it seems pretty good. And we can see that the certainty of the evidence is moderate. And that means that we can make the statement that fewer children probably get diarrhea. So the probably reflects that we're not completely certain because we have moderate certainty evidence for this outcome. If we thought that was a large effect, we could say something like probiotics greatly reduce the number of children who have diarrhea. For the next outcome, adverse events, the results show very little difference. So 35 children compared to 33 children experience an adverse event. And that confidence interval is pretty wide and shows a wide range of possible results. And the certainty of the evidence is very low, so you might not really want to focus too much on those actual numbers anyway. So here we can say we don't know if it led to any side effects because the evidence is really uncertain. We just don't know what's going on there. And then this last outcome, which is a continuous outcome and always a little bit tricky, is duration of diarrhea. So in the probiotics group, apparently the probiotics led to sort of 0.6 days shorter length of diarrhea than in children who didn't get the probiotics. But the problem with this information is it doesn't say how long the diarrhea usually lasts. So it's like 0.6 days shorter than what. And really that information should have been included in the table so that we can understand what that result actually means. But if we assume that diarrhea lasts for 3 days in children who didn't take the prebiotics, so in those who did take prebiotics, diarrhea is roughly half a day shorter than that 3 days. And that confidence interval shows a range from more than a day shorter to almost no difference. So that doesn't seem like an important difference really. So we could say it's equivalent to sort of little or no difference, and the certainty of the evidence is low. So we could say that probiotics make little or no difference in how long diarrhea lasts. And we use may to reflect the fact that we only have low certainty evidence. So we bring all those narrative statements together. The results for the review might be described in a way like this. So fewer children probably get diarrhea. It may make little or no difference to how long the diarrhea lasts, and we don't know if they led to any side effects because the evidence is very uncertain. So hopefully those statements were quite brief and clear, and we could, if we wanted to, also then add in and specify the grade certainty. So that's a little bit more information for people to understand. And for many readers, those kind of statements would probably be enough. For instance, if you were a parent and your child's taking antibiotics, it's probably enough for you to know that fewer children will get diarrhea when they're taking probiotics at the same time. However, while those words are more accessible, numbers can be more precise. And by presenting the numbers, people can make their own judgments about how important those differences are to them. So ideally, we'd like to use both words and numbers, and this may be particularly important for outcomes that are really important to people. So for instance, if one of the outcomes we just looked at was death, then reporting the numbers would be really useful and informative. So I'd say probably the more important the outcome, the more important it may be for people to see the numbers so that they can make their own judgments about the result. But the challenge here is that it can be really difficult to incorporate numbers in the text in a way that's simple to understand. So we want to be using absolute effects wherever possible. So for example, we could add in some absolute numbers into one of our statements from before and say that 9 children per 100 who were given probiotics had diarrhea compared to 19 children per 100 who didn't get probiotics. Or we could even refer to the confidence interval and say something like between 7 and 11 children given probiotics have diarrhea. But this would start to make what was quite a simple statement relatively complex and dense, and this is just for one outcome. So what about if we're talking about presenting more than one outcome here? It's a lot of people for people to get their heads around. So the amount of information we choose to include often involves making judgments, and we'll choose to present information differently to different audiences. So I'm just going to run through a couple of examples of things, reviews that I've worked on recently, where we've tried to use the grade narrative statements in the summary versions and in some of the dissemination products. So this is a review about interleukin-6 blocking agents for COVID-19, and this is an extract from the abstract. You can see the authors have tried to, adopted some of the narrative statements we talked about to describe the result for tocilizumab on clinical improvement at day 28. So the length of follow-up specified because that's important to know. And they've used probably to reflect the moderate certainty of the evidence. And they've described the relative effect, which was 1.06, as little or no increase. And helpfully, they've also reported the absolute effect. So 31 more per 1,000 people experienced clinical improvement at day 28. But information about the absolute effect in the control group's missing. So perhaps this isn't as clear as it could be. How many people experience clinical improvement without taking this particular drug? But the authors have kind of given us a bit of a clue there because they've said there's little or no increase. And so they've obviously concluded that 31 more people per 1,000 experiencing clinical improvement isn't a clinically meaningful result. They've taken a similar approach to reporting mortality and death as well. And here you can see at day 28, they've used a clear statement that tocilizumab reduces death. And that reflects the high certainty of the evidence for this particular outcome. And obviously, death is a really important outcome. And so they've reported the absolute reduction in deaths. So 32 fewer deaths per 1,000. And there might be as many as 52 fewer deaths or up to, maybe 9 fewer deaths. And that's still an important difference. And this is really useful information to include. Obviously, the authors are limited by the amount of words they can use in an abstract, but if you were summarising this review for a different audience in a different format and not constrained by the restrictions of the Cochrane Library, you could think about other ways of presenting these numbers, maybe in a table or some other kind of visual representation. And in the learning module, we've added a link to a resource from the Winton Centre, so the real risk tool that they've created. And that might be quite a fun thing to explore if you're wanting to create visual summaries of data. So this next example is a complex review, and it's looking at diagnostic test accuracy. And this is about rapid point of care tests for SARS-CoV-2 infection. We've focused on disseminating findings for intervention reviews, but there might be times when you're faced with disseminating other review types. And in those particular situations, I'd encourage you to work closely with the authors or the review group to try and communicate some of the complex concepts that are within some of these reviews. For this particular review, given the complexity of the topic and the amount of information, the authors participated in a press briefing with the Science Media Centre in the UK, so they could explain the review findings to and answer questions from journalists. So this review included several different tests, and there are lots of numbers involved. So this is just a snapshot of the the summary findings table, and you can see that this is like a fifth of actually this table. It goes on for several pages, and so we've got various different numbers. We're talking about effectiveness at different prevalences. We've got true positives, false negatives, true negatives, positive predictive values and negative predictive values. And this is just a selection of the tests that they actually looked at. So how did we go about talking about the findings of this review? So we produced a press briefing, but also in the abstract, we're sort of summarising the information there. So clearly talking about the information, the numbers is important, but there's a lot of information to summarise. And so we had to make judgments about what to focus on. So the decision was made to focus on results for the most accurate tests and use the results at the lowest prevalence. And we took a slightly different approach to describing the numbers depending on the audience. So in the abstract, we talked about 5% prevalence, but in the press briefing, we sort of described that as 50 per 1,000 people with symptoms. And we also used different ways of talking about the frequency of false positives and false negatives. So in the abstract, a slightly more technical description of between 1 and 10 and 1 in 6 positive results being false positives. But in the press briefing, using more absolute numbers, so between 5 and 9 positive results being false positives. And lastly, this is a recent review which the KT team helped to disseminate about the impact of stopping smoking on mental health outcomes. So when the review was published, it was featured on Cochrane.org, and which was sort of gave a brief summary of the review findings. So in helping to draft the feature, I started by distilling the grade narrative statements from the summary of findings table, and kind of came up with this sentence. So the evidence will reassure people that stopping smoking will not worsen their mood, may improve their mental well-being by reducing anxiety, depression, and stress. But thankfully, somebody with fresher eyes than mine asked whether this sentence could be misleading because it made it sound as if the person's mood is unaffected as soon as they stop smoking. But the studies didn't measure outcomes until at least 6 weeks after people had stopped smoking. So people in the studies might have had a really stressful and difficult 6 weeks when they first stopped. And I've missed out really important information about the time point at which the outcomes were measured. So in the final piece, it's published on Cochrane.org, the sentence specified the time point. So it was much clearer about the review findings and doesn't give false expectations to people who might be thinking of stopping smoking. So hopefully this example has kind of shown you that getting the thoughts and views of others will improve the accuracy of your messaging. And with that in mind, we're going to break out into small groups and make a start on task 2, which is on the LXP. But the link to that is actually being shared in the chat box now. So if you click on that link, you'll be able to open the Word document, and that contains all the information you'll need to complete this task. So you're going to work together to draft narrative statements based on the information in a summary findings table. And if you understand the principles of how statements are formulated, then hopefully you'll feel more confident using them in your dissemination. So just a little bit of information about the review and the summary findings table. So this review is about circumcision devices compared to standard surgical techniques in adolescent and adult male circumcision. And so this is quite a common surgical procedure performed in men and usually carried out because of medical problems. They're usually carried out by doctors in a surgical procedure, but some like to use circumcision devices instead because they think it saves time and might be simpler and safer than a surgical procedure. So you'll have time to discuss maybe 1 or 2 outcomes in the session now, but you can complete the rest of this table for homework later on on your own. And I'd suggest that you start with the very last outcome in the table, so patient satisfaction, because that's a bit more straightforward. And if you finish that one, then by all means move on to another outcome in the table. But yeah, start with this one. It should be grayed out in the Word document that Dario shared in the chat. So I'm going to hand over to Dario or Ollie to explain how the breakout session is going to work.
Yes, thanks, Liz. So I suggest everyone should download this document, which I've shared. It's also in the Learning Experiences platform, but it's easier, I guess, for you to just download it from here, from the chat. You will be sent to breakout rooms. We'll have you there for about 12 minutes. And perhaps 3 minutes before the end of the breakouts, we'll be sending you a reminder that it's 3 minutes to the end, and we'll also send you our thoughts or our experts' thoughts on this particular outcome and how you could think about it and what might be a correct solution if there is one. And perhaps you can then just have a look at that comments in relation to what you've discussed in your small group. There will be about 5 people in a group, and you will be just automatically sent out there and then pulled back into the plenary, so you don't need to press anything, click anything. Okay, that's all. Ollie, I think we can go to breakout rooms.
Thanks, Dario. Just opening all the rooms now.
Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope you found it interesting and useful to talk to each other. A reminder that you can use the chat function in the task to discuss or ask each other questions as you're working on completing the rest of the statements. And you can also bring questions to the Q&A session later in the month. And I also saw that there were lots of discussion in the chat while I was talking. So we'll pick up on some of those issues as well in the Q&A session when we catch up later. We'll share our suggested statements on the learning platform as well, so you can take a look at those once you've had a chance to work on them by yourself. So just some take-home messages quite quickly before we close. So always present the certainty of evidence alongside the effect. The summary of findings table is always where you should start. So for review authors and editors, ensuring quality and consistency of the summary findings table is really important. And for disseminators, if you don't understand something, it's likely not your fault. Ask the authors or the review group if you're struggling to understand something or you need more information that's not in the summary findings table. Developing narrative statements is a judgment and not an exact science. So we want to ensure that underlying messages about the evidence are consistent across dissemination products, but the wording you use will vary depending on the audience. And collaborating with others will improve your narrative statements. So finally, homework. So on the LXP, there's a task, a first task to do a quick quiz to test your knowledge. And then task 2 is to complete the narrative statements that you began in the breakout rooms. And then we have an optional task for you where you can share an example of good or poor practice that you might have come across in presenting the evidence, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a Cochrane review. And there are also some additional resources on the LXP where you'll find links to Cochrane training if you want to learn more or refresh your knowledge about summary findings tables. There's some useful reading about the difference between no evidence of effect and evidence of no effect. And also some links to some interesting research about communicating on certain evidence to the public, and maybe we can pick up on some of the challenges that those papers raise in the Ask the Trainer session. So I'm going to hand over to Stephanie to close the session.
Thank you so much, Liz and Nuala, for that very informative webinar. I see there were lots of questions in the chat, and I'm sure many of you still have questions. So please post those in the Learning Experience platform under the recording for this webinar, and they will either be answered on there or at the Ask the Trainer session in 2 weeks. Next slide, please. So very, very briefly, 2 weeks from now, 30-minute sessions. You only have to go to one if you want to. It's the Ask the Trainer session. We're going to have a few more people on the panel this time so that you will be able to ask a wider breadth of questions. If possible, please post your questions in advance on the Learning Experiences platform. This helps make sure that we can come up with a very quick, concise answer to your question, and we can fit in as many as possible in those 30 minutes that we have. And we're going to prioritize questions related to the topic of this month's module, but feel free to ask general dissemination questions as well. We'll try to answer as many as possible. But I'll be in touch with an email just to remind you for the Ask the Trainer sessions. And that's it for now. So thanks again, Liz and Nuala. We'll see you on the online Learning Experiences platform for any questions or comments you have. And we'll see you again on here in 2 weeks. Take care, everyone.